Hello and welcome to another brand new episode of the Empower MEN1 podcast. My guest today is Brad, who I think has quite an exciting connection to MEN1, something a little bit different. So I've asked him to come on and share about his experience around the condition and what it is he's doing at the moment to perhaps change the way that things for this condition might look in the future. So welcome, Brad. It's super exciting to have you on here. If you could explain to listeners who haven't met you before, what is your connection with MEN1, with the community? How has MEN1 shown up in your life so far? And yeah, what is it that you're up to at the moment that gives you a link to this condition?
So I was born with my mum having MEN1 and my granddad had MEN1. My mum herself never found out whether or not I have it as a child, and even now I'm now 19, I still don't know whether or not I have
Amazing. So you have obviously a family history of MEN1 and your mum has it. And that's actually how I met you, was through your mum. Um, you're studying at the moment at university genetics, I believe, which is obviously very interesting because of the kind of connection you have with with a genetic disorder. Tell us a little bit about that. What inspired you, if anything, to get into genetics? Was it, the MEN1 story in your family, or was it just a totally, random decision, or was it something you've always wanted to do?
it. In secondary school, I really wanted to be in the RAF. That was my big life goal. And I must have just reached teenage years when my mum mentioned MEN1 for the first time as a faulty gene. Um, and she mentioned that it might mean if I had it that I couldn't go into the RAF. And I remember going to school and asking my biology teacher, literally in the first couple of lessons, what is this faulty gene? And I must have asked around 3 or 4 teachers and no one ever answered. I, now looking back at it, think that they knew what I was trying to say, but didn't want to give me information without my family doing so first. Um, so as things went on, I ended up at college doing biology, chemistry, and maths at A level, in the hope of going on and doing medicine and then getting into the RAF that way. In my first year, I then received a letter from the NHS. I received a letter from the NHS, and I was under 18 at the time, asking if I wanted, I think it was if I wanted to be tested for the disease, um, which my family intercepted and then explained a bit more into the science side of it, kind of. Um, I then completely dropped the idea of the RAF. I didn't like the idea of, it's not a company, but of an employer rejecting me because of something I couldn't stop. And I then, in secondary school, I absolutely hated genetics. I hated biology. It was my least favorite science, which for people who know me now is quite strange because it's one of my big parts of my personality is I love genetics. And in college, then I really got into especially genetics, but also cancers and tumors, etc. So I, having found this random love for genetics and during college, applied to genetics courses at 3 universities and biochemistry courses at 2 universities. And that's how I ended up here at York doing a bachelor's in genetics.
It's super cool, I think, hearing, how things started and how radically they changed. Because obviously, had you not necessarily known about this condition, you might have ended up in the RAF. And now you're studying genetics, which is a big change, definitely. So, what is it about genetics that you love studying? Is there something in particular, or is it just the whole topic that fascinates you?
I think MEN1 definitely drove my interest at first. It was, like I said, I strongly hated genetics in secondary school. So it was weird that suddenly my mind just kind of went, oh, I actually love genetics now and I'm going to do it forever. Going and studying it more and more and more, I've fallen more and more in love with it with every new topic. So currently I'm doing the mathematics side in population genetics, which is less of an interest, but it's still interesting. But the molecular side of it, seeing how molecules fit together, and especially in MEN1, I ended up writing it all down. I went through a bunch of papers and tried mapping it all out. And it's just amazing how such small things inside of us, we have millions, if not billions of them, and just a small change, such as the one found in MEN1, it'll the drastic effects it can lead to.
It's amazing. I think, as you say, to have that understanding of MEN1, which, a lot of us won't have because, for example, me, I was just given the diagnosis and I understand the science to a certain degree, but beyond that, it's like, no, I don't really get it. So it very much has to be spoken to me in kind of layman's terms, but I'm still interested. But I think for you, to have that connection is super cool. What does your family think of you going in and studying genetics, particularly your mum, obviously, because she's the one with the condition? Is it something that she's really supportive of?
Yeah, everyone in my family is really supportive of the idea. My mum especially, I don't quite think she'll come up and openly say, "Oh, I absolutely love the fact that you're doing this," but she does, and I think it does come across in a lot of our conversations. She's not particularly biology minded. I can go into the science for days, and she's your average person biology wise. She won't overly understand all the molecules and things, but she's definitely someone who I know will listen to it. And obviously, she has a much more even more personal interest than I do, because I don't know if I have it or not. So yeah, but everyone, my nana, my grandma, everyone's really supportive of the idea. Especially as well after I changed over from the RAF. That was I think it all happened within a week, which is really quick. I had to go into college and I had to explain to my tutor and everything, like, I'm not going crazy. I've decided to do this for this reason. And everyone, thankfully, has been really supportive of it.
Do you think that in some ways, maybe having your background in science and, the fact that you're studying genetics, do you think that adds a layer of understanding maybe to the condition, which perhaps other people might not have?
Oh, definitely. Last week, for example, I literally just Googled the disease and I was sat there reading through papers for a few hours. And your average person can't really, I mean, to some extent, I find it boring because you found one and it mentions something, which means you then have to open up another paper to find out what this thing does. So it is just a whole of, you're constantly going down and down, deeper and deeper. But it is definitely interesting, even just to see the top layer of it all and explain it in very simple terms. I love it. It's fascinating.
And obviously you're studying genetics at the moment, and you've got your whole life ahead of you and a whole future, and I'm sure a career. Where do you see this taking you, if you've even thought about that yet? Do you have a kind of big vision, or are you just sort of taking one step at a time?
To some extent, I've got the big vision of I definitely want to go and study MEN1, and I'm not going to say find a cure, not too often, but I do want to work on it and see if things can be improved from the way they are, or even just genetic diseases on the whole, if that's a thing that I have to do. And as a result of, on the whole, MEN1 will be cascaded into that. So definitely in the next few years after I've got my master's and hopefully a doctorate, I would love a career studying, researching MEN1 or similar diseases.
Is there anything in particular about MEN1 that fascinates you? Is there anything, obviously, your kind of area of expertise will be around the genetics, but is there something that's kind of sparked your interest and you've thought, okay, I've got to go and look into this more, and it's become kind of, I don't know, like a bit of like a research project for you?
At first, I've got to say it's rarity definitely sent me off on a wow. Like, I think that to say it's between 3 and 20 in every 100,000, which in the city I live in would make there be between 12 and 160 people or something like that with the disease, which is fascinating. That means I could have it and sit here and be in this city for the rest of my life, and I'll never meet another person with the disease. But also the tumor forming side of it, I I found a big interest in that because of how it links to cancers, and they are so closely linked. And obviously, cancer is such a big thing in the world at the moment, and it will be for the next couple of decades, I assume. Just such that close link that I could read out all of the information on MEN1, and if you just change a couple of things across, it will translate directly to most of your common cancers. And yet at the same time, it's this such a rare disease that no one's ever heard of.
That's fascinating, isn't it? I think particularly with the crossover with cancer. Is there what is the crossover? If you were to explain it in really simple terms to someone who understands that, MEN1 is a form of cancer, but it's so different. Is there anything that's like that you can give us that would help us see what the similarities are?
So MEN1 is a mutation in a gene that codes for menin, which you can quite clearly see the gene is literally called MEN1 as well, which makes it really confusing. And this gene itself is a tumor suppressor, which is why the mutation itself causes tumors in the endocrine system. So there's a whole cascade of things that happen once you've broken it, we'll say. But it essentially messes up these other genes that they're called proto-oncogenic, which is a long word. And usually these genes tell our cells when to divide. So I say tell, they don't obviously tell, but they cause our cells to divide at a certain rate, maybe once every 4 hours. And when these genes are mutated, similar to MEN1 is, these become oncogenes. You just drop the proto, and that causes a rapid division, because instead of telling the cells when to divide, you're just telling them divide now, divide now, divide now. And that obviously causes loads of cells rapidly dividing, and a lot of rapidly uncontrolled cells. A lot of rapidly dividing uncontrolled cells is the literal definition of a tumor. And it's when that tumor spreads that the definition becomes cancer.
Wow. That's fascinating for me, particularly because, as I say, I've heard some of these words like, menin and tumor and MEN1 in isolation, but I think to get them together as you've put them in the picture is really helpful to know. And so for someone who's a patient who might not understand, much about the science behind it, and a lot of the time, disease, I think the emotion around disease is fear because it's so unknown and we don't really know a lot. What is it that you've learned from your studies in genetics, or just your experience with, having MEN1 in your family so far, that means that, we don't necessarily need to worry, or actually, what is it that you could say that might reassure someone who is quite fearful?
One thing especially is that science is constantly pushing new things out that might not cure something, but can keep people going for longer. There are new things coming out every day. Scientists are finding new ways to sickle cell disease, I think, has been cured to some extent. So it will just be a waiting game, and that might not be in the next 100 years. It might be in a long time yet, which I know isn't the best thing to hear. But it does mean that down the line, there will be a way that potentially these things can be fixed, or at least people's lives prolonged. And obviously modern medicine has done such amazing things anyway over the last 200 years. Genetics especially, and I am a little bit biased towards the meta, I suppose, but I do think it is definitely the up and coming science in the next 100 years. I heard someone recently mention it in the past. Between the 40s and the 80s was the atomic age. Between the 80s and now was the information age. And then post-COVID, we've kind of had this new genetic age. We saw with COVID, the COVID genome was sequenced in March of 2020, weeks before we went into lockdown. So that shows how quickly that happened. With science the way it is, I don't think there's any need to worry. But it will always worry people. I've always said people fear two things. It's that you can't understand and that you can't control. And sadly, we can't understand or control MEN1, no matter what. So,
I think that's such an important point you've just made. And I agree with you. What we fear is what we can't understand and what we can't control. And I know from my own patient experience that part of my journey has been about being able to understand and accept those two things, and then instead putting my focus on what I do understand and what I can control. So I think that's a really, really powerful point you've just made there. Brad, I can't thank you enough for your time. As I say, you're a very unique guest to have on here, being, as related to an MEN1 patient, having MEN1 in your family, but also with the study of genetics behind you, which I think gives you a very interesting perspective. And I think anyone who's watching this back or listening will take a lot from what you said. So I can't thank you enough for your time, and I wish you all the best in your studies, and no doubt that the pioneering science and progression that's happening at the moment, you'll be a part of that, I'm sure, in years to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.